Hello, I'm Ben Rampton, and in this talk I want to try and do justice to the subtle linguistic mixing and blending you find in a global city like London. If you ask somebody about the different styles of English that people speak in London, they'll probably list Cockney, posh, London Jamaican, multicultural London English, and then as an afterthought, they'll add on something like maybe foreign or immigrant. It's this last category that I want to talk about. Yes, there are lots of people in London who grew up in other countries, speaking other languages, but if they've been living here for 20, 30, 40 years, if they've raised English-speaking children, is foreign really the right description? So that's the language learnt in London part of my title. I'm thinking about people raised in another language who came and settled here as adults. The second part of my title is Breaking the Mould in Sociolinguistics and Second. What I want to say here is that long-term London residents who were raised abroad, people in London, living in London, who come from another country, they're rather a problem for two very, very well-established linguistics research traditions, sociolinguistics and second language acquisitions. Both types of linguistics are potentially interested in this kind of person, but in different ways they're both rather biased. What sociolinguists like to do is to focus on a way of speaking that doesn't match the standard, and then they like to show that once you look at it in the right way, actually this non-standard style is really good. It works really well. If you think that the style's problematic, then that's your prejudice, and you obviously need a good dose of sociolinguistics. Second language acquisition also specializes in non-standard speech, but instead of giving it the thumbs up, there's a lot of worried head shaking, a painstaking diagnosis of the linguistic disorders, followed up with a prescription that sends a non-native speaker off to the local adult English class. In short, if you get these two types of linguists to look at the very same London resident raised abroad, the sociolinguist will weave you a romantic story that celebrates the difference and creative agency of the speaker, while the SLA specialist will talk to you about deficit and remediation. Now, I can't see that either of these accounts gets us very close to the reality of a place like London, where you can get knockout rhetoric delivered in random grammar, just as you can hear polished syntax falling absolutely flat rhetorically. So, as linguistic analysts, what do we really need to do then if we want to improve our accounts of the contemporary urban soundscape? Well, here's an overview of how I'm going to try to tackle this question. And one of the first things I want to say is that we need to expand our definition of the basic entity that we look at in linguistics. There's a very helpful definition in linguistic anthropology, and this expanded conception of what to look at is what one of North America's leading linguistic anthropologists, Michael Silverstein, calls the total linguistic fact, which he identifies as the datum for a science of language. Now, and here is how he expands on it. The total linguistic fact, the datum for a science of language, is irreducibly dialectic in nature. It's an unstable mutual interaction of meaningful sign forms, contextualized situations of human use, and mediated by the fact of cultural ideology. Well, let's break this down a bit. What linguists need to look at, says Silverstein, is the unpredictable and dynamic interplay between three things. First, sign forms. That's linguistic signs and structures of the kind described in phonetics, morphology, and syntax. Second, situations of interested human use. That's discourse in context, situated interaction, pragmatics, purposeful exchange of meaning. Third, cultural ideology, which refers to social knowledge and to perceptions and beliefs about culture, language, and society. And all of these things are going on at the same time whenever we communicate in language. Okay, you may say, but so what's new? Well, actually, it's not very common for linguistic analysis to investigate linguistic form, situated discourse, and ideology all together at the same time. Think, for example, of variationist sociolinguistics, as pioneered by William Leboeuf. Yes, we have linguistic form, ideology, yes, with all the work on attitudes and evaluations. Situated interaction, not really. Conversation analysis, interaction and linguistic form, okay, but no ideology. Critical discourse analysis, linguistic form and ideology, yes, but not nearly enough situated interactional processing. Okay, then, you may concede, form, discourse, and ideology aren't routinely treated together, but so what? Does this really matter? Well, yes, it does. And to understand why, we need to go back to the Silverstein quotation and focus on the words unstable and irreducibly dialectic. What these words mean is that you can't just take one or two of the elements in the total linguistic fact and read off the rest. You might be looking at the linguistic structures that someone uses, but that doesn't tell you about their social beliefs or how good they are as talkers. And you can't assume that just because someone's grammar is idiosyncratic, that they'll have problems in interaction. In fact, that's been precisely the problem when sociolinguists and second language researchers have looked at resident Londoners raised abroad. They've studied just one or two elements in the total linguistic fact and then shot from the hip, filling in the gap with the biased common sense that I criticised at the start. If you want to get a decent picture of how English features in the lives of resident Londoners raised abroad, you need to try and look at the linguistic form, the interaction, and ideology all together. And that's what I'm going to try and do right now. In what follows, I'm going to focus on a man who says that he really only started to speak English when he migrated from India to London in his late 20s. In the case study I'm going to present, first I'll try to locate the man in the local area where he actually lives, and I'm going to work with the fact that in neighbourhoods where there are long-standing transnational links with another country, the boundaries between host and migrant can get blurred, so that what sounded foreign 30 years ago may sound quite local today. Second, I'm going to look closely at how this man puts on different voices, and I'll try to identify some of the social images and stances that he evokes when he does these different styles. Crucially, I'll attend to the likelihood that in a second language, the formal, the interactional, and the ideological dimensions of language develop at different rates. In other words, the learning doesn't all happen at the same time when it comes to distinguishing different social types, recognizing that these different social types use language in particular ways, and then reproducing these particular ways of speaking with the right linguistic forms. Here's a slide that gives you an overview of the project that I'll be drawing on, but for time reasons I'll skip past this and instead I'll turn to Mandeep, who came to London 8 years before we met him. So here's a first slide summarising what Mandeep told us in interview, and I'll just leave it for you to read yourselves. Here's another. Let me elaborate on this last point about social stratification. Mandeep was aware of the social stratification in English speech. He said accent is to do with watching telly, talking to other people, sometimes saying English, you're swearing a lot, yo mate, or something you're doing, and then you're glorifying yourself. Some other people are glorifying you, then you develop that accent for the whole of your life, and then your family says, no, that's not the way how to speak. Plus, it wasn't just Anglos who acted like that. The children of Indian subcontinent, the third generation, know other things as well, pub culture, these sorts of things. And now they're as bad as the white partners and as good as white partners. They're now normals of this country. So to sum up these interview findings, there are 3 points to make. First, it's not just me linking Mandic to second language learning. Learning to speak English as a second language has been a significant part of Mandeep's experience in London. Second, it looks as though there are at least 2 important lines of local sociolinguistic differentiation. Yes, we've got Indian versus Anglo on one axis, but in addition, we've also got high versus low, posh versus vulgar on another dimension. At the same time, third, it looks as though the stereotypic links between language, ethnicity and class have all been scrambled up, and we'd go seriously wrong if we just accepted the traditional image of a minority ethnic second language speaker migrating into a host society dominated by a first language ethnic majority. We'll see the importance of all this if we now turn to the quantitative analysis of stylistic variation. In our analyses of style in Mandeeps English, first of all, we did a quantitative analysis of style shifting, rather like Leboeuf. We looked at how Mandeep used Punjabi and Anglo variants in the English that he produced in 3 settings, and Table 1 shows what we looked at: L's, T's, and the face and goat vowels in 3 contexts. And what we found was that yes, there was style shifting. In the chart, brown is Punjabi and blue is Anglo, and as you can see, Mandeep used most Punjabi variants with his Punjabi friend at home and fewest Punjabi variants at work in the presence of an Anglo colleague. Now, this isn't really any news. Lots of studies of second language speech have produced findings like these. But the plot thickens when we bring other informants into the picture, and we discover that even though these other speakers had been speaking English since early childhood, the patterns are broadly similar. So Here are the bar charts for Anwar, who was born in Britain, who's 40 years old, and who runs a successful local business, travelling a lot between London and Pakistan. Now, Mandeep's obviously different from Anwar because he doesn't use glottal T in green, and I'll come back to that later. But before that, bringing in Anwar to compare with Mandeep shows that A, nowadays traditionally Punjabi retroflexion, post-vocalic clear rails and monophthonged face and goat vowels, those aren't foreign any longer in British-born London speech. So Mandeep wouldn't have to completely lose those sounds to sound local. And second, the direction in which Mandeep adjusts his style, using more Punjabi sounds with Punjabis, more English sounds with Anglos, that's broadly in line with the directions of shift produced by people who've been speaking English all their lives. So on the Anglo versus Indian axis of social differentiation, Mandeep's socio-stylistic sensibility seems to be roughly in tune with born and bred Londoners. In an interview, Mandeep had said that if you come to Southall from Punjab, you won't feel like you're living abroad. And there's support for this in these quantitative analyses of style. It's not just that you can get around with Punjabi in Southall, it's also that there's quite a lot in common between Punjabi and local English. Now, of course, there's lots left out from quantitative analysis like this. There's no view of the talk's discursive development, no view of changes in footing, topic, genre, etc. And if you just look at only 4 out of potentially umpteen linguistic variables, you can't tell whether overall Mandeep's speech sounded more Anglo or more Punjabi at different times with different people. So let's turn to some discourse. Mandeep told a lot of stories in his interview with Lavanya Sankaran, and it was when he did character speech in stories that his accent became most Anglo. Now here coming up is an example from a story about the difficulties he had finding a job when he first arrived in England. All the employers were asking for experience, even in basic jobs.
Then I was saying, no, I don't have any that sort of experience. So they were giving me, okay, wait, and then after two months.
In line 5, Mandeep shifts into reported speech, slows down a bit, and he does the voice of the employers in exclusively British variants. So it looks as though Mandeep could do some pure Anglo. In fact, if you look at the mixing of Anglo and Punjabi features elsewhere in the story, for example, in line 2 where he says, no, I don't have any of that sort of experience, where again you can see a mix of different fonts in the transcript, well, that itself doesn't necessarily mark Mandeep as a second language speaker, because there was mixing even in the relatively formal English of Punjabis born and raised in the UK. So here again is Anwar talking about business with an RP speaking barrister.
The reason why I called you is I just wanted to let you know that he came and we decided not to pursue his case.
So if you get traditional Anglo and Punjabi features even among people who've lived in London all their lives, am I saying that after only 7 years in Southall, Mandeeps completely indistinguishable from everyone else? No, I'm not, because of what's on this slide here. Anwar could do long stretches of pure Anglo if he wanted. Mandic couldn't. It was very rare to find a clear separation of Anglo and Punjabi variants in Mandeeps narratives. And of course, that itself raises a question. If Mandeeps was actually rather rare in the consistency of its phonological anglicisation, how did he actually manage to do voices that sounded traditional Anglo? If his mobilisations of linguistic code resources were somewhat unpredictable, how did he achieve stylistic effects? How did he bring off an Anglo voice? Well, let's turn to Mandeep's stylisation of the local Anglo-English vernacular, moving from an Anglo-Indian axis of differentiation to socially stratified class styles. And as we do so, we'll go back to the total linguistic fact and we'll begin to see how important it is to analyse sign forms, discourse and ideology separately before putting them together in a more general interpretation. In the interviews with Mandeep, there were clear signs of his class consciousness when he talked about pub culture and linked accent to watching telly, swearing, behaving in ways that got you into trouble with your family. Now, how far did that class consciousness translate into his own dramatised speech performances? And rhetorically and dramatically, how successful was he when he tried to produce traditional working class London styles? Now, in the excerpt I'm going to play next, Mandeep's been arguing that people make too much of a fuss about racism and that you shouldn't overgeneralise about racism on the basis of single incidents. And as part of this argument, here now is Mandeep presenting the hypothetical scenario of a white man shouting racist abuse.
If someone just misbehaves with you, someone drunk white person, and you are just passing by or something, he saw you, you bloody Asians, why you come to my country or something, that's not racism. That's, he may be reading Sun only, so he may be just listening about some like why they came to our country. He may not know what the economy is, what the contribution of migrant people to British economy, so he don't know anything. He just shouting at you and then swearing even. That's not racism.
Mandeep describes the character as ignorant, drunk, uncouth, informed only by the very lowbrow popular press. In effect, he describes him as a stereotypical lower class white racist. And in line 5, the segmental phonology in his performance of the man's speech sounds more Anglo than Indian. You bloody Asians, why you come to my country? But does it sound more vernacular? Here it is again, this time with a more detailed transcription.
You bloody Asians, why you come to my country or something? You bloody Asians, why you come to my country or something?
Segmentally, the onsets of the diphthong vowels in Asian and Y sounded RP, and in fact there's also a detectably Punjabi influence in countries. Even so, there are lots of semiotic cues showing that Mandeep's aiming for something more than just ordinary British. The vowel in my is like popular London speech. You bloody Asians is very marked suprasegmentally in pitch and voice quality. There are the words drunk, white and reading Sun. So even though the phonetics aren't especially vernacular, this isn't rhetorically incapacitating. Yes, if you played this impersonation of a white London lout outside its particular narrative context here, it might be difficult to work out what's intended. But in the story he's telling just at this moment, the voice works reasonably well, and we can hear that it's a portrait of Anglo-vernacular English. So, even though Mandic wasn't terribly good at doing traditional London vernacular vowels and consonants, he knew that they sounded different, and he didn't mind trying to do them himself. In fact, there's more evidence that he was aware of vernacular London even though he couldn't do a perfect imitation. And here we'll also see that he also knew that vernacular forms could mean rather more than just, I'm a working class Londoner. You'll remember that in his interview comments on accent, Mandeep linked swearing a lot to saying yo mate. And in fact, he pronounced mate as yo may.
Yo may, yo may.
In contemporary vernacular London, the post-vocalic T in might is a glottal stop, not an alveolar. It looks as though Mandeep got halfway. He removed the alveolar, but he didn't replace it with the glottal. Instead, he did a zero realization. In fact, if we think back to the quantitative style shifting analysis earlier on, Mandeep hardly ever produced glottal T's, and Sharma and Sankaran's survey showed that he was very similar in this to lots of other informants born in India. But not being able to do perfect glottal stops didn't prevent Mandeep using what he could do, zero T's, strategically in the dialogues he performed in other narratives. In the final excerpt just coming up now, Mandeep's continuing his argument that accusations of racism are often exaggerated. He's just been talking about the notorious episode in Celebrity Big Brother, which involved the Bollywood star Shilpa Shetty. And Mandeep's taken the line that when the other contestants criticised Shilpa for touching some food, they weren't being racist. The complaint, he says, was just normal talk. Well, now he follows this argument with a story about being ticked off by his mum when he was small. His overall point is that there's very little to distinguish these two episodes, and here's the story now about Mandeep getting ticked off.
One day I was very little and my mum bought some carrots, and I put all the carrots in as outside on the sand, so I spoiled everything. So she slapped me that I bought that for us and you put everything away. So that's not racism, that's simple talk as well. And that was and other thing is,
let's look closer at how Mandeep distributes alveolar and zero T's across this story. In the bits leading up to the ticking off, there are 7 places where Mandeep makes a T sound, and all of them are standard English alveolars. But in the direct reported reprimand in lines 41 and 43, all 3 T's are zero realizations, bo, the, pu. And after that, the zero realizations are carried into the evaluation in lines 45 to 46, the, no, the. So there's a pattern here, and I've summarized this in table 2. It looks as though Mandeep's done these zero T's on purpose. So what does it mean? Well, first of all, the zero T's in lines 41 and 43 contribute to a character portrait that's very different from the white lout in the Sun Reader episode. In lines 41 and 43, the speaker is Mandeep's mum, and she's saying the kind of thing that Mandeep approves of, simple talk, that only the most misguided would read as racism. So if it's not just unruly working class types that Mandeep is trying to portray with this concentration of zero T's in lines 41 and 43, what is it? Well, if we think back to British-born Anwar and look back at the quantitative data on Anwar's style shifting, T-glottaling in green increased with family and friends. And of course, that's a pattern that's repeated not just with other locally born individuals in our survey, but in British society much more generally. Vernacular forms often index not only types of person, but also types of stance and relationship. In the quoted speech in the Carrot story, the glottal T approximations seem designed to evoke the intimacy or the informality of a mother-son relationship, a relationship which Mandeep seemed quite happy to inhabit. So yes, Mandeep's reproduction of the linguistic specifics of stereotypical vernacular English forms, that's only partial. He can't quite get all the way to a properly glottal T, but he knows that the social meaning isn't just restricted to particular groups and types of people. It's also linked to familiar and informal relationships. Zero T's and connotations of informality. Well, if we go back to the total linguistic fact, that's two of the elements: linguistic structure, zero T's, social knowledge, connotations of informality. What can we say about how these zero T's operate in interactional discourse, the third element in the total linguistic fact? Well, here I think we have to say that imperfections in Mandeep's phonological performance took their toll. The evocation of informality doesn't work nearly as well as the impersonation of the Sun Reader in the earlier extract. Compared with the earlier extract, there's very little supplementary characterization of Mandeep's mum in The Tale of Spoiled Carrots, and the sociolinguistic iconography associated with mums is generally much vaguer and more indeterminate. So overall, Mandeep's stylized performance of his mum sounds odd rather than indexically resonant, and it certainly took our research team quite a lot of time and analysis to generate a plausible interpretation of what he's trying to do with his zero T's. Let's now move to a general discussion. Stepping back from the analysis, first I'll say something about London as a sociolinguistic space, then I'll comment on Mandeep's position as a second language speaker, and last I'll comment on the crucial analytical moves that I've made. So let's take London first. Well, at several points I've referred to stereotypic imageries getting scrambled. You don't feel like you're living abroad if you come to London from the Punjab. Traditionally Indian immigrant features now form part of the local London vernacular. Punjabis play cricket for England. But this mixture doesn't end up in kaleidoscopic chaos. And in my analysis of Mandeep's style shifting, we've seen Mandeep position himself within quite a well-defined sociolinguistic space. Now this is a space that's been formed at the historical intersection of socioeconomic stratification within the UK on the one hand, and migration and movement between Britain and India, Indian subcontinent, on the other. In this space, class and ethnic processes have drawn different sets of linguistic forms, practices and evaluations into the environment, and over time these sociolinguistic forms and practices have been configured in a series of conventionalized contrasts: Punjabi versus English, vernacular versus standard English, high versus low. And as I've tried to show, Mandip made rather energetic use of these coordinates. Well, what about Mandip's own position as a second language speaker? When we compare Mandip's English with the English of people like Anwar, who'd grown up in the neighbourhood, there are lots of ways in which Mandip's English looked more limited, and I've summarised these on this slide. Even so, it wouldn't be an accurate reflection of what we've heard if we just categorised Mandip as a second language speaker outside the London sociolinguistic economy, aspirationally looking in. First, Mandip himself insisted that in his maths class I'm perfectly fine, and in the interview stories he presented himself as a now established citizen of multi-ethnic London, among other things siding with the Anglos, criticising Shilpa Shetty. Going beyond this explicit self-placement, second, there were a number of similarities between Mandip's stylistic practices and Anwar's, and I've summarised these on the slide as well. You might take a second just to read these. So, even though Mandip only started to speak English as an adult, and even though Anwar's stylistic range was far wider and more subtle, Mandip still displayed a practical sensitivity to key dimensions of local English sociolinguistic structure. And I don't think that a label like immigrant learner of English does justice to Mandip's position in the local London speech economy. Well, then finally, what about the analytical moves that have led to this conclusion? There are two key points here. First and most obviously, in our project we deliberately avoided putting first and second language speakers in different boxes, treating them separately. Among other things, we found that first language speakers don't talk quite as we might have expected, and the moral of this is that if you want to talk about the target language in second language learning, you need to be rather careful. If you're not, you could easily overestimate the linguistic distance that newcomers have to travel. Second, we've really slowed down in the analysis, and in this talk I've looked at stylistic moves individually. I've broken them down into the linguistic forms, the discursive acts, and the ideological images that compose them. I've considered each of these in turn, and then I've looked at the effects of combining them. As a result, we've developed quite a nuanced picture of Mandip's second language English, seeing how it forms part of larger sociolinguistic structures and processes. But in doing all this, I haven't, I hope, either romanticised or remedialised this particular speaker, either by erasing the differences and limitations in his English or by exaggerating them. So with the carrots extract, we've seen that although Mandip grasped the relationship between informality and vernacular style, he couldn't produce the linguistic forms very accurately, and this made the interpretation quite tricky. On the other hand, in the story about shouting, the impersonation of a lower class white man showed that an imperfect grasp of vernacular Anglo forms isn't necessarily an expressive handicap. When it comes to humanising migrants, seeing London residents who've been born abroad in their embedded complexity as mothers, brothers, uncles, friends and workmates who also make an active contribution to local sociolinguistic processes, I'm not sure that linguistics is always very effective. Yes, it's quite easy to focus on the structural details of second language speech, or to study how newcomers have to struggle against monolingual ideologies, but the old categories and distinctions built into the study of language can't adequately capture the new lines and alignments that have emerged in contemporary urban environments. If we want to understand these new social formations, I think we need to abandon the ways in which sociolinguistics and second language acquisition have traditionally carved up linguistics and language study. And we have to commit to the total linguistic fact, climbing out of the comfortable separation of linguistic form, discursive interaction, and social knowledge. Or at least that's what I've tried to argue in my analysis here. You can find a written version of this presentation in Working Papers in Urban Language and Literacies, paper 98, posted on Academia EDU. And there's a version in the book Language and Superdiversity, edited by Catalano et al., published in 2016. And here are some of the references that I've drawn on in this presentation.